Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to start with a beracha kedarkenu b'kodesh leilu nishmat Sar Hatorah Hagaon HaTzadik Harav Shemaryahu Yosef Chaim ben Rakev Yisrael Kanievsky Zechet Tzadik Lebracha. Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Sha'akol Nihiyah Bidvaro. Know this: whatever we say will not do justice, not even a drop in the ocean, from what should be said. And we're here tonight to clarify and understand that we don't understand who we just lost. That's precisely the purpose for tonight's Hespedim. To give us an inkling into someone that we were lucky enough to have in our generation who did not belong amongst us. He was an absolute Hesed Hashem. It was Borei Olam's kindness and mercy that we were able to have someone like the great Reb Chaim Kanievsky Zatzal amongst us in a generation today. When he was young, only the age of bar mitzvah. At that time, he started to speak and learning with his uncle, the venerable, the great Chazon Ish, already from the Gedolei Hador of the world, let alone Eretz Yisrael. That's right. Know the lineage of the greatness of the great Reb Chaim Kanievsky Zatzal. He was the nephew of the Chazon Ish, the son of the Steiplers Gaon, and the son-in-law of the great Rebbe Elyashiv, Zechet Tzadik Lebracha. Wow. I think that really says it all. What else are you going to say after that? At a very young age, at the age of bar mitzvah, the great Reb Chaim Kanievsky, young boy, already made it his business to start speaking and learning divrei halacha she'elot with his uncle, the Chazon Ish. And he would go over to his uncle and speak to him for hours and hours on end, in divrei Torah, in sugyot, in eyun, in halacha, in learning. The Chazon Ish was so taken by the breadth and width of the bikiut of this young bar mitzvah boy, Reb Chaim, that the Chazon Ish was known that he went to his brother-in-law, the Steiplers Gaon, the father of this boy, and he said to the Steipler, Chaim's bikiut is a zecher of the Rogatchover Gaon. Do you know what it is to say a statement like that? Rogatchover Gaon? Do you have any idea who the Rogatchover Gaon was? From the greatest geniuses that ever lived. And the Chazon Ish said on his young nephew at a young age of bar mitzvah that his bikiut was a semblance, a zecher, a reminder of the great Rogatchover Gaon, the genius and giant at that time in Dvinsk. Could you imagine that? Could you imagine that statement? You know, when the great Reb Aaron Kotler, Zechet Tzadik Lebracha, once was by the Rogatchover Gaon and he was talking to him and learning, the Rogatchover was very, very sharp. And most people were too scared to talk to him and learning. Because after a moment of two of speaking to him, he already saw where you're holding and learning, and he let you know it. So most people were too scared to speak to Rogatchover Gaon. He was very charif, very sharp. Rabbi Aaron Kotler, Zechet Tzadik Lebracha, was speaking to the Rogatchover and learning. And this conversation went on for some time, which most people didn't get that far. And at the end, the Rogatchover was impressed, and he turns to Rabbi Aaron Kotler and he says, "So what do you do for a living?" Rabbi Aaron was too embarrassed to say that he was a rabbi. So he said he was a balabat. So the Rogatchover looks at Reb Aaron Kotler and says, for a working man, you're not bad in learning. For Reb Aaron Kotler. Said the Chazon Ish that this young boy Chaim, he tells the Steipler Gaon on his son, your son Chaim has the semblance, the zecher of the bikiyut of the Rogatchover Gaon. That is unbelievable. And that tells us that we have no clue who the great Reb Chaim Kanievsky was, not at the age of 13, not at the age of 33, 73, or 94. We have no clue. A giant amongst us. Rabotai, Reb Chaim as a boy would sit in the Ezrat Nashim, very young age, and there were people there in the shul that would actually try to tease him. They would come up to him. They saw this boy sitting in the Ezrat Nashim with a Gemara opened at all times, and his finger would go down the page as if he was literally scanning the page. From top to bottom, he would go down the page, and then he would turn the page, and then he would go down again top to bottom, and then he would turn the page and go down again page top to bottom. And people thought it was comical. Look at this young boy, 7, 8 years old, scanning the pages of Gemara, as if Ke'ilu they thought he was actually learning. And they would kid around, they would even tease him. To the extent that one time someone went to the Steipler Gaon, and he said to him, you know, your son sits in the back, and he puts his finger down the pages of Gemara, he puts the finger down the pages of Shulchan Aruch. You know, that's not a game for kids to play. He's being mevazeh the Sfarim. The Steipler looked at the guy, and he said to him, you stay away from my son. Leave him. Luz him up. That means leave him. Leave him. You see him going down the pages? One day he's going to know every page by heart. And this is already what the Steipler was telling us about his son, the great Reb Chaim, to be. And Rabotai, when they came to the Steipler Gaon, and they said to him, Harav, the Steipler was known that he had an incredible schedule of learning, and he wouldn't waste a moment, the Steipler Gaon, of course. But when it came to certain things, the Steipler was very makpid, especially when it came to sandakaut. When anyone offered him sandak, he would take it. He would even travel for it. On anything else, he wouldn't give up a minute, not a second at a time, when it came to learning. But there was one thing, when it came to being sandak, he would never let an opportunity go by. And Rabotai, we should take lesson from this. I think we should appreciate this incredible zichut of being sandak in your life once, twice, your child, your grandchild. Don't take it lightly. It's an incredible zichut to be sandak. And be careful with the person you choose to be sandak of your child. Because it's brought in Divrei Kabbalah that the sandak has a tremendous influence on the baby of who that child one day is going to be, on his mazal, on his yirat shamayim. So be careful who you give sandak to your child, Brit Milah. And now you understand why so many people in Bnei Brak would come running and they would beg the Gadol at that time, the great Steipler Gaon, to be sandak. The Steipler would get sandakaut Mondays and Thursdays constantly. Mamash. He got it hundreds of times. And he would travel all over Bnei Brak and even further just for the opportunity to be sandak. Sandak again. One time a person came and asked him, said, Harav, you told us, and we know, that the kibud of being sandak by Brit Milah is an amazing sigula for ashirut. And you told us it's badukum nuseh. If you take a look in the Karna to the Igrita, written by the Steipler Gaon, how he talks about this concept. How it's baduk mnuseh, tried and proven, that someone who's sandak the right way, you come to me afterwards, I'll tell you what the right way is. You'll be surprised. It has to be done the right way. But when it's done the right way, it is a guarantee for ashirut, for the sandak. So they came to the Steipler and they said, Harav, you did sandakaut hundreds of times. Where's the ashirut? The Steipler lived in the most simple of simplicity, in a small little apartment, with nothing fancy, with absolutely what you saw. Where's the ashirut? You told us. It's a guarantee. Nobody got it more than you. Said the Steipler Gaon. How do you define ashirut? Ashirut is the wealth of what it means to you. What is your ashirut? Sandaku brings to a person a guarantee of the ashirut of what ashirut is to you. If ashirut is money to you, then that's what you'll get. But that's only what you'll get. If ashirut is something else to you, then that's the ashirut you were blessed with. And it was at that moment that the Steipler turned to the makshin, the guy that asked him the question, and he took him by the arm and he pulled him back to the back of the shul and he said to him, you want to see my ashirut? You want to see the blessing of the guarantee of all the sandaka'ut that I sat? And he brings him to the back of the shul and he points to a young boy. He said, my chaimel, that's my ashirut. He is the ashirut of all the sandakaut. He's the blessing from Shamayim that Borei Olam gave me. Shh. Wow. And he was a blessing to Klal Yisrael, not just to the Steipler Gaon. He was a blessing to all of us. And how Reb Chaim sat literally hours upon hours upon hours with unbelievable patience, and people would come up 23 Rashbam and they would make it up those steps and they would fight their way to get up another step and another step till they finally got up to the top to the door, and then finally someone would call their name and squeeze them through the crowds and get them to the back room, and there's Reb Chaim. And Reb Chaim had the patience to go through the tsarot of people and listen and give them birachot and buha day and night. Mamash. His chavot were only a few hours. His chavot, which he called his time for learning, that he finished every year on Erev Pesach, he made siyum of kol Hatorah kula. We don't even know what that means. We don't even know what kol Hatorah kula means, let alone to be Messiah it. But he was Messiah Babli and Yerushalmi and Rambam and Sifri and Sifra and Mishnah Brura and Mishnayot. It's unbelievable. And the list goes on and on and on. And Zohar. And Kol HaTorah Kula. He finished it. Siyum. Every year. Erev Pesach. And then besides that, he still had time for people. And he sat hours upon hours on end, receiving us, and giving chizuk and birachot and divrei nevuah. One time they asked Reb Chaim, why do you spend so much time Kabbalat Kahal? You're putting even more time to the tzibur than your father did. And you know what Reb Chaim answered? He said in Hebrew, Ulai bizchut zeh anachnu hayim. Did you hear that? Ulai bizchut zeh anachnu hayim. Maybe this is the zechut of longevity. Maybe God gives us a longer life with more time in this world for the sake of others, so that we could spend time not just on our own accomplishments, but the accomplishments of giving chizuk to those in Klal Yisrael who desperately need it. The broken hearts of Israel. Maybe that's my zechut to continue to live, said Reb Chaim. You think I'm doing them the favor? It's ki'ilu they're giving me the zechut to go on with life. But that's the way a gadol looks. Gidolim, it's never about what they're looking to get from you. Gidolim, the gadlut, is always about how much can I give you instead. Not what I can get from you, what I can give to you. That's always what gadlut was when it comes to the great Gidolim. And every minute, every second to Reb Chaim counts. You know that many of those pictures you're going to see on the different programs, you'll see, especially in later years, Reb Chaim is always sitting by a Gemara, always, in all the pictures. He's always sitting, you couldn't catch him. He's always sitting by a Gemara. And there it was, with his index card, situated perfectly in the middle of the Daf Gemara, and he would have the index card go down the page, line by line by line, as he would read and memorize, going down the page of Gemara, line by line with his index card. One time someone asked him, Harav, why do you use an index card to sit and learn? Why don't you go down the page with your finger? And Reb Chaim answered, when you go down the page with your finger, sometimes you tend to skip a line. And at that moment you realize that you skipped the line. So it takes you a second to chop that what you just read doesn't flow with what you're reading. So you jump back to the previous line to catch back to the line you're really up through, and that wastes a second of Torah learning. Says Reb Chaim, I don't have that second to waste. And therefore when I learn with an index card. So when it goes down the page, I'm sure never to skip a line and not to waste a second of Torah learning. Do you see what a second of Torah meant to the great Sar Hatorah, the great Reb Chaim Kanievsky Zatzal? I can't believe I'm saying the word Zatzal. It still didn't register by me. It still didn't sink in yet. How did we lose Reb Chaim? How do we go on without him? But every moment, every second to him counted. But from those seconds, he was ready to give up his days, to hear the cries of Klal Yisrael and the worries and the broken hearts, and give them the time. Because in the words of the venerable, great Reb Chaim, Ulai bizchut zeh anachnu hayim. It's for the people that we're getting longevity, we get life. Amazing. I'd like to tell you for a moment, my first encounter, the first time I met the great Reb Chaim Kanievsky. It's a moment I'll never forget. It's over 20 years ago. I came to Eretz Yisrael, and I called a good friend of mine, a guy by the name of Reb Nosson Yafi. He's the one who runs Kupat Ha'ir in Bnei Brak. We became friends because of the wonderful Chinese auctions that they made here in the community. I used to speak for them a little bit, and we became close. I come to Eretz Yisrael, I say, Nosson, I never met Reb Chaim Kanievsky, Zatzal. Can you get me in? He says, absolutely. Meet me by 23 Rashbam at this and this hour, and I'll take you in. So, I come up the steps on time. Nosson Yafi is running down the block. Reb Duvi, you have a pen? You have a paper? I said, a pen? A paper? Why? He says, you have to write down what exactly it is that we want to ask. I said, really? I said, that's the way Reb Chaim gives berachot. I said, I know by the Rebbes they do that, but Reb Chaim is more of like a Rosh HaYeshiva style. You talk to him, you tell him your issue, he gives you the blessing. He says, yeah. He says, but the first time you see Reb Chaim, I'm advising you from experience, from the many people that I brought into him. The first time you meet him and go into him, write down what you want to say. Because I am telling you, many people, the first time they saw Reb Chaim in real life, they were shell-shocked. There's an or, there was a magnificent glow on his face, and your brain goes blank. Blank. I was looking, I was like, okay. I said, Duvi, let me just write it down. So, okay. I took out the paper. I wrote down all the points I wanted. I'm holding it. We go inside. There was no Kabbalat Kahal at that time. Reb Chaim was actually sitting in the back, sitting and learning by a table. I walked in with Nosson Yafi. And as I walk into the room, I look at him and I was like, wow. And I'm telling you, pshuto kemashmao. My brain went blank. I'm telling you, I did not remember my name at the moment. And he turns to me and he says to me, Reb Chaim looks up from the Gemara, he says to me, go ahead, tell Reb Chaim what you need. And I was humana. And Nassim smiles and he says, you see? He walks up and he pulls the paper, pries it out from my fingers, puts it down on Reb Chaim's desk. Reb Chaim goes through each one. And I'm telling you, there was such a glow. The room was lit up. His face was shining. It was an experience of the first time of standing in front of Gadol Hador, and you see mamash kishemesh acharei tzahorayim. I came to, I snapped out. And Reb Chaim started giving blessings on each of the points that I had on the paper. Till finally I mustered myself back up. And I looked at the great Sar Hatorah, and I said to myself, I'm going to do this. I hope this is not going to come off chutzpahdik. But who else can I ask this question? You know, they used to ask the Navi of the generation the following question. And I said, Harav, with my broken Yiddish, Harav, tell me, what is my tafkid for my neshama in this world? What am I here to do in this world? What's my job? Tell me what my chiyuv in this world to accomplish. And at that minute, Nassim Yafi's jaw dropped. And he looked at me like, you didn't just ask that. I said, yeah, I said, Navi Hador, this is what you ask. You can't ask anybody else. Reb Chaim looks up from the Gemara, and he told me, word for word. He didn't even bat an eyelash. He didn't even pause. It was like toch kedei dibur. The minute I asked him, what is my purpose in this world? What was I put here to do? He said it on the spot, and he minced no words. Wow, was that experience. I kissed his hand. I made my way out. And I'm telling you, that night I did not sleep. It was the first time I was ever there. And ever since, I went, I don't know how many times, and every time the experience was surreal, including this past January. This past January, when we were by Reb Chaim and we saw him for the last time. And he was very, very weak. Borei Olam was mizakeh us. To see somebody that makes a siyum al kol hatorah kula. I mean, this was unbelievable. And I'm sure you're going to be hearing now the incredible stories that are going to come out. The books that are going to come out. And they're going to blow your living mind. The stories that they say over about Reb Chaim is the stories of Nevi'ut. Nothing less. I'm sure you heard that story about that young boy in Bnei Brak that came in with his father, and the father was asking Reb Chaim, is it okay to cut the boy's hair even though he's not 3 years old yet? The upsharing, which is normally done by many of the Ashkenazim at 3 years old. And Reb Chaim says, why not? And he says, because the boy was just diagnosed with a brain tumor. We don't know if he's going to make it to the 3rd birthday. Can we cut his hair now? And Reb Chaim smiled and said, don't cut his hair. He's going to make it to his 3rd birthday. He's going to have arichut yamim v'shani. And then he calls to the Rebbetzin, bring the wine from the siyum of Kol HaTorah. And they bring out the wine. And Reb Chaim tells the boy to drink the wine. He makes a beracha with him. The boy drinks the wine from the siyum that Reb Chaim made on Babli, Yerushalmi, Sifri, Sifra, Rambam, Mishnah Berurah, Mishnayot, Zohar. And the boy drinks the wine. 2 weeks later, the father comes back to the house. I heard this from one of the Shamoshim over there in the house, and the father was crying and dancing, do it himself. His child just came back from MRI. Klum! They said to Reb Chaim, is this a moifis? Is this a miracle? This is a mofet, right? There's a mofet. Is a mofet? Chaim said, not mofet, no. He said, what, mofet? He says, the Torah is Etz Chaimi. And when I gave him the wine from the siyum of Kol HaTorah, the Torah, the Etz Chaim, entered the boy, and it simply did what any Etz Chaim would do. Got rid of the problem, ba'arichut yamim v'shanim. It was pasha to him. You're going to hear these stories. You're going to hear stories that are going to literally blow our minds. But this is going to be the semblance and the remembrance of who we had and who we lost. This past January, my brother-in-law spent a Friday night meal by the great Rabbi Yaakov Hillel, Shalita, Arichut Yamim Mishanim. And he was going around getting blessings for his daughter to get married. And Rabbi Yaakov Hillel asked him, so which rabbis did you go to? And he starts telling him, I went to this tzaddik and this tzaddik and that tzaddik, and this one gave me a blessing. Rabbi Yaakov asked him, did you go to Reb Chaim? He said, yes, I went to Reb Chaim too. What did he say? He said, Buha Mazal Tov. Rabbi Yaakov Hillel says, if that's the case, Mazal Tov. He said, but Harav, I told you I went to this rabbi and this rabbi and this rabbi. I went to the biggest rabbis. He says, yeah. He says, all those rabbis you mentioned, what they gave you are berachot. But Reb Chaim gave you divrei nevuah. That was the difference between him and everybody else. He was the Urim v'Tumim of Klal Yisrael. Mamash, the Urim v'Tumim. The Navi Hador. And his words were divrei nevuah. To have that. And you look back now and you say to yourself, when my son's bar mitzvah took place in Israel, I took my Yitzchak Zev at 13 years old to Reb Chaim. It was in August. It was 102 degrees in Bnei Brak the day we walked into Reb Chaim's house to get a blessing for my son, Yitzchak Zev. 102 degrees. American boy walks into Reb Chaim. How do you think he's dressed? With a short sleeve shirt, right? I mean, it's 102 degrees. So my son and my son-in-law, Ramiz, we walk in together to Reb Chaim. And Reb Chaim looks up and he smiles. And I ask him for a beracha for my son, his bar mitzvah. And Reb Chaim starts laughing and he says to me, there isn't enough money in America to find a little bit more material for long sleeve shirts. We were laughing. So I took off my jacket and I put it on my son. He was standing there with sleeves going down to his ankles. And that's when Reb Chaim gave him the blessing. My son-in-law asked him for a blessing for a baby boy. They just got married. And Reb Chaim said, what's wrong with girls? Reb Chaim, he was in a very happy, laughing mood. And my son-in-law said, nothing. I'll take any beracha that the Rav gives. So the rabbi gave him a blessing. You should have 12 girls and 12 boys. And my son-in-law looked at me, and I looked back at him. And what's amazing is that just a day or so ago, he just had his third boy. And we're asking Borei Olam and the Zechut of the great Reb Chaim that these boys should grow up to be great Talmidei Chachamim. Reb Chaim had a love, and he had an unbelievable softness for Klal Yisrael amongst his greatness. So I want to close with this idea. Rabbi Yitzchak Zilberstein, he tells us that Maisa, that story that everybody knows. When Reb Chaim wrote the book Karnei Chagavim, he wrote that book. You know, Reb Chaim would write Sfarim in areas of Torah that nobody really had much of an idea about. In order to revive those areas of Torah, he used to call those areas met mitzvah. And he was coming to save them and revive them and bring them back to Klal Yisrael. So one area, he wrote a book on grasshoppers, on locusts, what was kosher and what's not. And over there, as he's writing the Sefer, there was one very rare and unique grasshopper. And he was writing about it, but he had a safek on this particular grasshopper. And just then, this very rare grasshopper jumps through the window and lands right on the table of Reb Chaim Kanievsky. And Reb Chaim picks him up and examines him. And after he finishes examining this very rare grasshopper, he finishes writing the notes, the grasshopper takes off. He had that amazing siyata d'shmaya, but you think that that's the end of the story. Reb Gedalia Reb Gedalia Honigberg, in his Sefer, writes the end of a story that nobody really knows. There was an expert in Israel on chagavim, on grasshoppers and locusts, that came to challenge Reb Chaim Kanievsky's Sefer, saying that he got the nature of certain grasshoppers that he wrote about in the Sefer wrong. And this guy was the number one guy. And he comes now to Reb Chaim, and he tells Reb Chaim that he got all these things wrong about certain locusts and grasshoppers. And Reb Chaim had such agmat nefesh. He was so upset, he was so hurt. He spent so much examination, analysis to put out this Sefer. And now this expert is telling him he got it wrong. Just then, this very grasshopper that they were being mitvakeach, which is a very rare, very seldomly found anywhere in the world, this particular grasshopper jumps through the window and came back. Landed right on Reb Chaim's hand. Reb Chaim looks at the expert who is standing there, Hiloni, and he tells him, is this the one you're talking about? You told me I'm wrong. Let's examine him together. It's like amazing. And they examined and they found out Reb Chaim was right. The expert was wrong. Exactly the way he brought it in the Sefer. Reb Chaim gave hakarat hatov to this little guy and sent him off. Because that is someone who, when he has a handle on Sar Hatorah, he has a handle on the reality of the entire world. And that's who we lost. He was the great wall of Klal Yisrael, the Shmirah of a generation. Rabotai, the wall of our Shmirah just came down. A tremendous vacuum of Torah learning was just lost. The vacuum was created, the volume of Torah learning was lost. We're going to need a whole nation to make up one Gadol's Torah learning. Could you think about that for a minute? We're going to need a whole nation to take upon themselves a little bit more learning, spread out thin over millions of Jews, to try to be able to fill the void of one Reb Chaim Kanievsky's learning, to make up one great Gadol's learning. But we need it. Because our Torah is the wall of our protection. It's magle umatzle. Magne umatzle. Torah is our protection. And when we lose a giant of Torah, we lost the wall. B'ten chelkeinu b'toratecha. We lost Reb Chaim's chelek in Torah. He was a wall of his own for the entire Klal Yisrael. And now that wall came down. We, every one of us, needs to grab a brick and line it with mortar and step up and do your part to put this wall back up quick. Because we need the Shmirah today in Klal Yisrael desperately. And I want to tell you a beautiful thought and I'll let you go. You know that that's Reb Chaim's chelek in Torah. And when you step up to fill that chelek now that he's no longer here, you actually will reconnect to what the tzaddik's life mission was. You're going to pick up his wall, his mission, his Torah. You connect to him. You remember the days we stood online and waited to get up those steps? You don't have to wait online now. Grab a Gemara, Le'ilui Nishmat, Shemaryahu, Yosef Haim, Kanievsky, Zechet Tzadik Lebracha, and pick up the learning where he left it, so that Klal Yisrael can continue the shmir of our Torah. But now, like the Rebbe said, Keli, Keli, lama zaftani. That was the moment that Esther lost her Ruach HaKodesh. And that was the day that we lost the tzaddik amongst us that had Ruach HaKodesh. That was the day that we lost the great Reb Chaim Kanievsky. And like the great rabbi, the Rebbe in Israel said, Hashem, on Purim, we sent you the most magnificent Mishloach Manot. Reb Chaim himself, we're waiting for you to return to us the Mishloach Manot. We're waiting for you to return to us the gift of Mashiach Tzidkenu.